I know all the chatting and networking is such fun, but we're now entering the last sort of session of our conference. And this afternoon's first session, we have a series of presentations on debunking myths about disinformation. So are we sure about the way in which we label things as disinformation? Is this effective? What do we do about deplatforming? We're going to dive into some of the assumptions and look critically at what we know and, of course, what we are missing. So it gives me great pleasure. The team are all assembled up here, and all I'm going to do on this occasion is to hand over to Laura Smillie, who is a policy analyst at the European Commission, and she leads the Commission's annual research programme which identifies the drivers of political decision-making, exploring the extent to which facts, values, social relations, and the online environment affect political behaviour and decision-making. So really in the hot seat with the work that you do. Welcome, thank you for being here with us, and I leave you to introduce the rest of your panellists, to whom all also a big welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diana. And thank you also to the rest of the EU Disinfo Lab team. It's been such a great event, and we're really pleased to be here. Up until now, there's actually been a lot of sort of thematic sessions, if you like, with perhaps CSO organisations sort of all talking around a similar theme. This is the graveyard slot on day 2 after lunch. So we're going to mix it up a bit. As Diana very kindly said in her introduction, my name's Laura Smillie. I'm heading up the wonderfully, pretentiously named Enlightenment 2.0 multi-annual research programme that is looking at the drivers of political decision-making. In working with multidisciplinary experts from around the world to try and understand these drivers, we have also been helping our colleagues in policy making to provide the scientific underpinning for things such as the Digital Services Act, for the vertical legislation on political advertising, on the strengthened code against disinformation, and we're currently reflecting on how we can be supporting the Protecting Democracy package that's forthcoming next year. So these are some of the things that we're currently working on. Very pleased in this kind of nice diverse panel that we have today to be reflecting upon the efficacy, really looking at, do things like labeling and deplatforming actually work? To introduce to you Hoffmann, who is the technical program manager at Logically. Hella is going to be going into a bit more detail of what Logically is actually standing for, what it's doing. But she's working at a technology scale-up that is really sort of looking at the human-in-the-loop AI technology and sort of how this can be playing a really significant role. Her talk today is on AI-enabled myth and disinformation detection, and she's providing a sort of state-of-the-art overview on that, which is combining both the AI and the human side. Then I'm very pleased to introduce Clement Wolf, who is Head of Information Quality, Policy, Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google. Quite the mouthful, Clement. You have very kindly joined us from DC, which I think is testament to the importance of the work of Alex's team. Today, he's going to be addressing labelling disinformation on Google and YouTube and how that is working and what the impact is like. And then last but by no means least, we have Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, who is a professor of cognitive science based at the University of Bristol, who'll be talking today on the impact of labelling on information and perception. So, we're going to be having about 10-minute sessions. Well, I'll be inviting colleagues up to the lectern. Then I'll be able to take a couple of questions. But just for the sake, you have a lovely, diverse panel. We'll kind of try and open this up a bit. So feel free to jump in, get involved. We want to hear from you. So Hella, please, the floor is yours. Thank you. Click a big green button.
Okay, cool. Right, can you hear me? Yes. Right, so as Laura introduced, I'm Hella-Hoffmann. I'm a technical program manager at Logically. So what's Logically? Our mission is to reduce the harm associated with mis and disinformation detection, and we follow a cross-platform, multimodal and multi-regional approach to that by providing an analytics platform that can monitor social media and news content. And our key focus is on kind of combining state-of-the-art AI with NLP, like with human experts. So we have a team of OSINT analysts and a team of fact-checkers. We're an accredited fact-checking organization, and we mostly partner with governments and kind of national security institutions. We work with some of the largest democracies in the world, and we work with platforms on fact-checking. So our focus area is on elections, national security, safety, and health. And I'm here mostly just to give you an overview of like what can be done, what is used in the space of kind of using AI to detect mis and disinformation instances, like, and you know, it's a combination of kind of what we see in the market and what we apply like kind of in-house as well. So I think one of the kind of myths I think are out there around you know, AI for mis and disinformation detection is just like it's algorithms that just go in and like kind of say what's true and what's not. And I think we're very much beyond that. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide to kind of, yeah, I'm basically just giving you some of the taxonomy so you can look up more information about it yourself as well. But I would say, you know, we've really shifted to kind of looking at more the whole mis and disinformation space and where we can use technology and identification mechanisms to sort of characterize it, to understand what's going on, and to track, to some extent, the impact of it. So what we see are kind of the application of early signal detection. So it's not just about like, you know, misinformation. It can be malinformation. Like we know memes are getting traction. We know like kind of there's rumors, there's certain patterns that we know are kind of you know, around like sort of influence patterns, like propaganda. So we can you know, use AI to detect kind of patterns in language or pattern in spreading behavior that are early indicators for influence or kind of going into falsehoods. And then basically it's about identifying, you know, when narratives have already been kind of a bit more established, is using AI and technology to keep a handle or an eye on like kind of what are they, how are they evolving. So, you know, one of the key focus of our platform is monitoring narratives. They don't have to necessarily be misinformation, but then we kind of can put layers on top of that to understand, you know, the threat levels associated with it. We can see, you know, who's behind it. We can see, you know, where parts are actually clear misinformation according to like, you know, accredited fact checks, etc. And so we then give that to experts to interpret. So the AI focuses much more on the prioritization, on the understanding, on the highlighting of content. And so this also goes into an area that we've heard before, for instance, you know, like Facebook's approach to CIB. Similar things can be applied to kind of look at behaviors of disinformation. We can use AI to detect those instances. And then also, like, you know, leveraging and integrating things like kind of expert knowledge graphs. So like kind of looking at, you know, like these are actors or these are domains that we know are suspicious. Can we use AI to kind of find similar instances and then flag them up when they gain traction, when the interaction gains traction, etc. And kind of the fourth category is around, you know, understanding then the impact or the effect of mis and disinformation. So how do we, like kind of, can we use technology and analytics to identify like what actually resonates, where again, like kind of content gains traction. We also look at, you know, kind of some spread, so we can say, you know, like, hey, there's more traction on one platform versus another, sort of to identify maybe some movements and then kind of do countermeasures. And the other thing is like, you know, the impact. So we have, for instance, on our platform, we have threat classifiers that can look at instances like threat intent. So if somebody, if in a given narrative, there's a lot of like kind of expression of threat to property or threat to life, like kind of threat, sort of basically intentions of harm, then those are obviously things that can be more effective in like kind of we can action that. We can, like, you know, we work with governments to sort of then like put a countermeasure in place. They can basically, like, you know, they could request for some things, they can request like investigations or fact checks, but, you know, we can also help share information with like governmental platforms to kind of alert them about these instances. And so to basically understand some of the limitations of where we're at, I just wanted to really briefly mention how that works. So, you know, it's a traditional kind of machine learning approach for most of these. All that AI can do, it's not something magic that kind of, you know, decides the truthfulness of the world. It's pattern recognition. So most of the time, what we do is like, you know, we just look at like historical data, we label it, we come up with taxonomies about, you know, what is misinformation, how does, say, you know, like kind of threat intent look like, for instance, from a language perspective, and what does a network of inauthentic coordination, like, you know, what are the kind of examples of that, like learn from that and like kind of detect so that we can predict unseen instances. And so, you know, there are approaches that are unsupervised that are more about similarity and data aggregation and like kind of clustering, so to understand the trends, but a lot of it is still relying on, you know, like kind of giving a specific, this is what we're after type of example, and focusing on historical labeled data. And so this obviously comes with some challenges because, you know, I mean, we all know how much information is out there. Social media and news to some extent is also kind of, it's a beast, you know, like it's, we're facing similar challenges to any kind of big data sort of community. So velocity, veracity, variety, and veracity are issues, you know, like we can't have basically analysts and algorithms analyze every single piece of content and know exactly, like, you know, kind of like where, what misinformation is. But, you know, like kind of, and obviously like challenges, you know, that we've heard about, multimodality, like kind of multilinguality, and getting access and having like even the same language to talk about things across platforms are all challenges that we're facing when we're looking at AI, right? Because again, keep in mind, you have examples from the past and you just collect those and then the AI can mimic those and make similar decisions in the future. So, you know, it requires like consistent data access, like agreed upon taxonomies, and even further, even if we had data access and, like, you know, kind of would invest, so it's very expensive to, you know, build these things. And so even if we have then instances where we can create a lot of, like, you know, labeled data, we train models, a big challenge is kind of the strategies that we're seeing or the language that we're seeing and the kind of techniques that are being used. It's constantly evolving. So, you know, our taxonomies need to evolve. We've heard these things, you know, and so that makes it hard for AI to adapt. So we need to constantly update kind of what we think AI in this space is and where it can help. And our approach, and this is where it comes in, like kind of, you know, relevancy and impact, like I've said, is so important, right? We really care mostly about the misinformation or disinformation that causes harm. That's really where we need to focus. And so, you know, our approach to this is basically like an integrated human-in-the-loop approach. So using basically, like, you know, kind of constant, like, feedback mechanisms where we, you know, we use our AI, we apply a model, we say kind of, you know, hey, here's a domain that looks suspicious or something, and that's even fed by the information that we have from our experts who are already aware of some of those. We use AI to kind of identify similar behavior, but instead of basically just kind of saying, you know, here's the automated, like, yes, no kind of signal, we give that information back to our users. You know, we enable them to kind of make the decision, and then feedback as well. You know, we need to at least kind of, like, knowing when something is going wrong, like kind of we need to understand what is being flagged, what is being kind of missed. So there's mechanisms, you know, to like kind of do just continuous monitoring and training. And the other aspect, though, that I feel kind of personally quite kind of, is quite important to me is, like, you know, integrating AI into the human workflows, really, like, kind of, you know, understanding how humans interact with the information. Like, how do experts actually, what is actionable? How do they action it? What are the things that they can actually take into account, and really model the workflows around AI and the use of these kind of models and the labels in a way that integrates into the workflows, because, you know, they are ultimately, like, kind of what AI is good at is, like, going through large amounts of content, but what the human is good at is the interpretation, and ultimately they have to action this. And so we kind of like record the decisions of our fact checkers, for instance, so we learn on an ongoing basis like what the language of misinformation is, at least according to the fact checkers. We integrate that back into our model. So there's an example from say the Ukraine, where we monitored a situation where we helped our fact checkers kind of like monitor at speed, like, trending claims on social media. And we use then the kind of our fact check database and the content within that to like prioritize the things that look like misinformation, given sort of the current, like, kind of topics and keywords, etc. So, that's kind of like an example of integrated, and you get basically interpretability and explainability kind of almost out of the box if you align it with how decisions are being made. And it's so important, right? Because we need transparency, and the adoption of that is also not going to be, given, like, there's a lot of academic research on some of these topics. It's all very hyped, right? But like, kind of, we're still today, I think a lot of the analytics that are being done to kind of action things in governments and so on are still, like, quite manual. So it's about bridging that gap and kind of edging more and more towards the use of AI in this space. Yeah, and so kind of to conclude, I think what, I think where we're at now with that kind of what we can do with labeling is much more enabling basically the experts, and that's kind of our own experts, for instance, working with government experts to identify, like, kind of to understand the online sphere more, to understand kind of, to get early signals, like quick alerting about the things that are really important. So, we basically, like, kind of the human in the loop approach for us is also like analysts on our platform can basically target their analysis to specific topics, right? We're not like kind of cross-platform, but that doesn't mean we monitor all of social media, right? Like, we point them at specific situations, like information environments that are kind of on the forefront of what's happening. So we work, for instance, with different institutions across the US on monitoring like elections, and like kind of what's happening, what is being said in those like in those information environments. And then we also help mitigate the risks in the way that, like, we can say, hey, these were the things, these were the hashtags that are trending, these were the keywords that are trending, like, kind of, maybe try to quickly spread a counter narrative. In the Ukraine, there were a lot of examples of, like, identifying these claims early on helped like, governments to kind of spread the narrative around some false flag operations kind of early. So, like, if you spread all the true content kind of earlier, then it's harder for actors to kind of, sort of say, hey, this never happened. So knowing which these instances are, like, we can really help kind of, put the effort where it's kind of needed. And yeah, and so I think that's my presentation.
Thanks so much, Hella. That was great. Thanks so much, Hella. I'm happy to open the floor for a couple of questions just now. Yes, please, over here. If you could just say your name and introduce the organisation you're from, please. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Leva. I work for Hate Aid. We're a victims counseling center, an advocacy organization. And my question is, because you flag these things to the platforms, what's their reaction, and do you get some useful feedback? And also, like, do they actually take into account, because they rely on, disinformation as well for their profit? And yeah, so sometimes it seems unbelievable that they would actually demote this content.
Yeah, so the parts that I'm familiar with on our platform, you can basically, like, kind of, do a takedown request. So it's more about deplatforming, kind of like at least sort of more targeting specific content to say, like, hey, this is part of a narrative that we know is kind of causing harm. And we don't necessarily see where exactly that goes. But what we also more do is, like, kind of, we're more looking, like, we're not really the decision maker on what gets done with that information. It's more like we give that to governments to kind of then, like, maybe also work with platforms or so to kind of, like, action some of that. So, yeah.
Thanks very much. Any other questions, please? Then I'm going to take advantage of being chair. I have a question. You're working at the sort of expert to expert interface across different stakeholders. do you find that your experts have peers and that are of an equal caliber across the different stakeholders?
I think it really varies. So I think the space is very much evolving at the moment. Like I think, you know, we're really starting to invest more into this space. I think there's even new jobs that are being created, you know, like kind of this whole, like we don't have kind of a lot of traditional experts on like kind of, you know, social media and how it's evolving, like kind of, so like we have world-class like OSINT analysts and like, you know, kind of they have like basically like, you know, very specific knowledge about certain domains and, you know, like they're geeking out on kind of like certain topics. And I think we're seeing that it's growing. So, you know, like I think part of our role in this space or like the kind of what we effectively play is also educational. So we kind of, you know, a lot of times government analysts will look to us and say, you know, like what is your definition of like, you know, kind of disinformation? How does that work? And like we kind of try to educate them on that or like kind of, you know, try to come to sort of a common conclusion. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Hella. Next up, please, we have Clement Wolf, who's going to be giving us an update on the situation on disinformation at Google and YouTube. Clement, please.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Right. Hi, it's nice to see you all. My name is Clement Wolf. I am here, indeed, I'm from Google. I'm here on behalf of a large team of people with diverse skills and perspectives working on these tools we're going to describe. And my goal today is to walk you through a set of things. First, a short reminder of what it is that we do writ large against disinformation, just as a milestone, but then going into a few of the interventions we are looking into right now that are emerging mostly and not really widespread in Europe just yet, so that you have a sense about how we're thinking about labeling and context in our services, go into some of the questions we're asking ourselves when we develop these interventions, and then talk about this notion of effectiveness for a second. So without further ado, I'll jump in. This is the perfunctory reminder that we do have more than one way of dealing with questions of information quality and disinformation. Again, today my focus will be on a very narrow set of these tools, but they only make sense in a context in which there are other tools deployed as well, and that's very important. So briefly, these tools involve elevating authoritative information, or raise in this slide, removing content or accounts that are either illegal or that violate policies, reducing in our ranking system the spread of potentially harmful content, and having a higher bar for places in which we monetize or enable others to monetize. And of course, those pillars apply differently to different services, whether you're a search engine or a video sharing platform or an app store, that's very different. But we try to deploy all of these levels the best way we can across these services. That was a reminder. Moving on to today's topic. Speaking of labeling and deplatforming, right? There's a challenge here for us as a platform because these terms are not necessarily universally defined. We don't necessarily think of deplatforming as a tactic, for instance. We just think of having policies that we apply. And if those result in content being removed or accounts being banned, then that's one thing. But deplatforming is not a goal in and of itself. Similarly, labeling might mean different things to different people. Is it that we show something under a piece of content, on a piece of content, as an interstitial, at the page level? Is it meant to be a pop-up? There are very different ways of thinking about all of that. So I think for us, taking a step back, the way we think of this labeling function is really a context function. How do we provide context to our users in our services and at the moment when they might need it the most to make good use of the information we provide them or think through their search journeys and better understand how to trust the information they see in front of them? So right now, we'll go into a few of the interventions we are currently testing, iterating on, have launched in the United States already and in some countries and will expand, just to give you a sense of where we're going with this. And we can talk about what we're trying to do with them and some of the questions about them. So, oh, is this working? It is working. Great. A first example is a search intervention we call About This Result, which some of you may have seen already. It will be accessible on your phones if you type any search and click on the 3 dots that might appear on the right hand of search results. Again, it will not be available for most of you. This is something we're rolling out very fast, but this is something that we are testing in beta, as you can see on the slide, in the United States. The purpose of this intervention is not directly misinformation related. Instead, it is to help people understand what they're seeing when they're seeing a search results page. In other words, for any one result, you can try to have information about a snapshot about the source, why you're seeing the specific result. Is it because of your search term? Is it because of something else? Whether it was personalized to you. And in that way, we hope you can learn to one, better understand the control you have on your search results, and two, better trust that what we're showing you comes from a clear space that you understand, which in turn hopefully means that if we show you helpful information, you can trust it more. So it's part of the answer here. If you see this slide, there is on the bottom of the first box something that's called More About This Page, which is where I'll take you to right now. So this More About This Page is actually the part that's more related to mis and disinformation or influence operation or FIMI or whichever Olga's and Lutz's favorite terms from this morning are the ones we want to use. Here, the purpose of this feature is to say you are a person who might want to have more context about a page on the open web. We're going to give you everything we can find about the source, what it says about itself in its own words, what others say about this source, has there been coverage about it in the news recently or anything else, and then more information about the topic that the page covers. For instance, again, has there been news coverage about it? Is there health authority information about it? And so on and so forth, all in one place. As you can see, this is still very early days for this feature in the sense that it's, first of all, not necessarily readily accessible for users. You have to click through 3 dots on the right of search results, then dive in. That's intentional. We're still improving upon it. We don't want to make it too prominent until we're very confident that it is actually quite helpful and it will be taken well by users. But on the flip side, the intention of this is to say, well, there is such a thing as media literacy frameworks, some of which are listed on this slide, that encourage lateral reading, cross-checking sources, and the more we can make it easy for people to use these frameworks naturally as part of their journeys on search and beyond, the easier hopefully it becomes for them to answer the question, can I trust this piece of content or this source? Do I understand where it comes from? What do people say about it? And so on and so forth. So see this not just as a current state of a product, but more as a direction we're investing in of figuring out what are the best ways to provide that information and to make it readily available over time to users across Europe and beyond. So that's one example of context interventions we're thinking about. Another one is what we call content advisories, and here too it's rolling out. Here the idea is our systems might have information about a search results page that you might want to know about when you see that page. For instance, it might be the case that you're searching for information at a time when our systems tell us the content on the search results page changes very fast. Why might that be? Well, you're searching for information during a breaking news event. There's a natural disaster. There's an attack. There's something happening where a lot of content is being created right now, and it's moving extremely fast. And so the search results page you're seeing right at this moment may not be the one you would see 5 minutes from now or an hour from now, which might in turn lead you to take for granted things that may not be in fact granted. So what you can see on the right-hand slide is something that tells you, hey, these results are changing really fast. Maybe you want to make sure that if you see a source on this page, you are certain of how much you trust it, or maybe you want to come back later and ask the same question and see what goes. Similarly, our systems might tell us, hey, we're not super confident in the quality of the results on this page. Now, you type the search, these are the results. We're not exactly sure that these are the best results you could get for something like this, or at least that we would want to be able to serve you. But here they are. We're giving you a warning that you might be cautious, you might want to be cautious about the source and how much you trust it, but have at it, this is your search results page. And finally, last but not least, there might be cases in which you type a search so niche that we don't have a ton of content to show you on it, and here too, we might want to explain the content you see here might not be very relevant, here's why, you might want to retype your search. All of this matters, again, in the context of helping people understand what they're seeing, why they're seeing it, what they can trust, and hopefully form better habits when it comes to searching online and browsing the web, right? Because ultimately, again, it's not necessarily the traditional definition of a label, but it's certainly a label applied to a search results page. It helps you contextualize it, and that's the goal. And so these tools, of course, are designed with the mind of making sure users understand what they're seeing and find it somewhat useful. Last but not least, and these you're way more familiar with, but I would be remiss not to mention them, we of course run a large number of information panels on the run of issues across Google and YouTube. You're seeing on the left-hand side an information panel about COVID, on the right-hand side on YouTube, information panels about state media funding, about recurring conspiracy theories like the moon landing, around emergency help phone numbers for Ukraine refugees, and the fourth one, God, I forget, and I can't see it very well, but there's a fourth one. But we do run these information panels either on the top of search result pages or on specific videos. The point here being to say, well, at what moment in a user's journey is it helpful to show them a piece of information, a nudge, that gives them a sense that there is an authoritative source about something that they might be interested in, or that's the topic of a video. And these panels, interestingly, are triggered automatically. We don't have a human deciding, oh, we'll show, under this specific video, we'll show the panel, on this one we don't. We'll come back to this in a second, but of course it's because we determine it's best to show these panels as much as we can, rather than be overly specific and miss on opportunities, if you will. So with that in mind, I'll just want to close on these set of features, which again are just a small sample of the things we're working on, to note that of course, every time we do launch one of these features, we do, first of all, when it's relevant, consult experts on the topic, whether it's health itself, like COVID, for instance, or media literacy experts, and also run user research to understand whether users feel like they understand what we're trying to do, whether they see it, whether they find it helpful, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the process. But with this being said, we still try to consider any number of things as we go through these launches. Examples include, what about adding more information to a contextual feature? Why wouldn't we do that? You saw information panels, some are long, some are short. Could we add more information? Here, the trade-off tends to be the more information we cram into something like this, the more we risk losing a reader and them being confused or feeling that they don't understand what the message is. So there's a trade-off here, especially in a world of limited screen real estate, about what you can put in a panel that is useful to someone. And even though you might want to add all of the information in the world, it's best to keep it synthetic. Another question is, how about frictions or nudges? Should these not be panels, but should these be pop-ups that sort of stop people from browsing? Here too, there's a question of trade-offs between, is it more disruptive to people and are they more likely to see it? Yes. But if it is too disruptive, are they more likely over time to hate it and ignore it? And that's also a yes. And so if you design a great intervention no one likes and no one wants to read, then you have a problem. And finally, can we make it more specific? Instead of having an information panel that reminds about the right information on COVID-19, could we not design an information panel specific to one video or one piece of content that says exactly what's wrong with it? And yes, of course you can, but then it becomes very, very hard to do this well at scale. And so you have to trigger your information panels much less because you do not have a way to know for every single video on the open web all of the information you could show about it. So those are some of the examples of the question we ask ourselves. And then there's this question that was the topic of this panel today, which is it effective? And that's where I get a little stumped. We know a lot, and I'm sure Professor Lewandowsky will tell us a lot about what's effective, of course. I wanted for this slide to have a graph of the amount of research published on these topics for the past 10 years, and God knows, I'm sure it's an upwards hockey stick. I'm sure someone has the graph somewhere. I don't, and I didn't have the chance to do it. The point is, published research is expanding in this space, of course, and we're tracking it closely. So you see here a few examples I've pulled out because they're some of my favorite papers, but there's many others. And anyways, what I'm trying to say is, even though there is all of this research, effectiveness is still a very complicated concept to manipulate. That's because it might mean very different things to different people, first of all, right? If we ask about what's effective, some of you might think, well, Clem, what's effective is when people's beliefs change. Some of you might say what's effective is when their behavior on the surface change. Some of you might say what's effective is when they feel they are more empowered to make the right choices. Those are all valid takes on effectiveness, but they're not necessarily compatible. They don't necessarily mean the same interventions. So we don't know always what we mean or who it's for. Are we trying to be effective and useful to people who are already believing some of these conspiracy theories? Are we trying to be useful to people who might be inclined to believe these conspiracy theories? Are we trying to be useful to other classes of the population? And that's where it comes to varying according to context, right? What's useful for a group that's, let's say, somewhat educated in Northern America might be very different for a group that's less educated and, let's say, in the south of France, or different languages, or different cultures, or different socioeconomic classes. So you do not have like one horizontal effectiveness metric that works across all of that. And even if you did, this third notion, which is it changes over time because people's habits change. So for instance, if you develop an intervention that seems helpful at first, but that over time gets seen as boring or intrusive or disruptive to experiences, people might decide they don't want to listen to it anymore. So you would have really good numbers in the first, 3 months, and then they would sort of shrink over time. And second, because bad actors adapt. If you're someone who is trying to game platforms, you'll see interventions and like, the first question is, how can I use this? How can I leverage this? Can I get other people's content labeled? Can I get the right labels on my content? Can I leverage what goes in the label? And it's a cat and mouse game that keeps evolving. And so there's not like a perfect way of developing future-proof effectiveness considerations, if you will. That's not to say we should not, to be clear. My argument today here is not to say, and therefore let's never talk about effectiveness again. It is rather to say, let's be very specific when we talk about it, about what we mean and what we're tracking for and how we intend to measure this over time and what we want platforms to do. Because if the message is, platforms, you should develop an intervention that is effective now, and when 3 months from now that metrics change, you should change the intervention, that's not really reliable. Like, we cannot do that over time, and especially not have 25 versions of each intervention around the world. So we have to make choices here that's somewhat normative and tied to what kinds of service we want to see in the world, more so than a sort of perfect effectiveness metric, at least at this point in time. That's my belief. To close here then, what's the road ahead for us in terms of this general space? Many things happening, of course, but we'll keep investing in some of these features you saw earlier and trying to make them better, more user-friendly, and more accessible. Again, we're very early stage in that journey. We'll make more public experimentation about interesting features to help users. You might have seen that our colleagues at Jigsaw are working in Eastern Europe with a number of you, I believe, on debunking initiatives, which are very interesting and promising. That's not exactly label, which is why I didn't include it here, but if you are interested in that, please reach out. And finally, we want to have more ecosystem-wide discussions about what is it that we should strive for in this space and what does count as helpful or unhelpful. And I would like to credit the Code of Practice on Disinformation for making some of this discussion possible. With this being said, I am done, and I'm sorry for going over time, I'm sure.
Thanks so much, Clement. So please, I'm opening the floor, lots of hands, I'm sure. Yes, the lady in the yellow jumper, you were first, please. If you could say your name and affiliation, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was super interesting. I'm Madeline. I work at the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we work in lots of different international contexts where different people are considered authoritative. So how do you define authoritative sources that you amplify?
That's a very good question, and it's a constant struggle. I think it depends very much on the intervention, right? So for instance, when these are, like, some of the interventions you saw were just information on top of search results pages. Here, we're not elevating any one authoritative source. We're just saying, here's something we know about the search results page you might want to see. Some of these interventions were about using our existing ranking systems to show you what we think is helpful information about the source or about the topic. Here, I'm happy to do a deep dive in our ranking systems if you like, but for the sake of keeping the answers short here, I will just say we invest a lot of time and effort, and we publicize a lot of information about thinking through authority in a way that is hopefully as context and language agnostic as we can. And granted, this is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something we try to address in the way we develop our ranking systems. Last but not least, there are information panels that you saw on YouTube, for instance, or on Google, which elevate specific sources. Those might vary across countries depending on the situation. I will also add that in the case of public communications efforts, for instance, around the COVID-19 pandemic, we also try to encourage health authorities to partner with local creators who have a lot of credibility with their communities to disseminate these messages. But I think your point is well taken. This is a hard question, and we don't have a perfect way to think through authority at a global scale, and that's why this is so challenging.
Thanks so much. Another question, please. Yes, Diana.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I like the way you're trying to, as it were, to educate into good browsing habits or searching habits or whatever. But let me try to make my question more specific. What occurred to me when I was listening to you is if you take our recent study, Doppelganger, and so you have malevolent actors masquerading as mainstream media, so Bild or Guardian, would your pop-ups see that, or is it just going to get the main sort of more well-known sort of activities, if I put it that way?
It's a really good question. In theory, and again, the point is no system that works at scale is perfect. So I don't want to make claims I can't back. But in theory, we design our system so that they would not mistake these copies for the originals, right? Because the ways that we determine what gets ranked prominently in our systems is not just based on the name of a domain, it's based on the links in and out of it. That's the public information, so I can say that, and as well as a number of other criteria which should help us differentiate whether this page that claims to be lemonde.fr actually exists and has existed for the past 20 years, or has it been created 2 weeks ago, and does it seem to have a lot of links for sources that refer to the Monde point affair, and so on and so forth, so that we don't make this sort of mistakes. Now, it's not to say we never get gamed, but it is to say that we have an anti-spam team who works really, really hard to ensure it doesn't happen as much as possible, if this helps.
Thanks so much, Clement. I'm going to close the questions there. I'm sure if there's any further questions, you can grab Clement at the coffee break. And last but by no means least, Steve, please, over to you to explain to us the impact of labeling on information perception, please.
Can you hear me? Is that on? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's been a fantastic conference. And now the race is on, because I have 10 minutes to touch on those 4 points that I think are all pretty important. The first one is to set the context. What is it we're dealing with? Why are so many people talking about the post-truth world? And why is disinformation all of a sudden so much of a concern? Well, here is one sort of fairly obvious partial answer to this, which is just the volume of disinformation that is out there. Donald Trump apparently made something like 30,000 or more false claims during his presidency, and that is a problem. But it's only half the problem at most, because in my opinion, the other half the problem is that it didn't have any effect on his approval ratings, which are shown here. And moreover, it also had no effect on the Republican membership, who by a margin of 3/4 considered him to be honest. And that, to me, is the second problem, and that is something that has sort of been coming up at this conference over and over again. You know, what's going on here? There's so much misinformation, and yet there are people who are buying this stuff. Not only do they buy it, but they also consider people who are dishonest to be honest. How can that work? Well, there's a number of different lenses one can apply to this problem. The one that I favor, at least for the moment, is that in some cases, lying can be a feature and not a bug. Because for a politician, telling an untruth is a violation of an establishment norm. And if you're a populist politician, then that to you is a sign of distinction, because you're violating a norm, you're thereby signaling contempt for the establishment, you're signaling being an authentic champion of the real people. And I think that is one overarching issue we have to understand, that under a populist logic of politics, honesty and truth don't involve veracity, but they involve authenticity, belief speaking, saying things that the people want to hear. And under those circumstances, lying becomes a feature and is not a bug. Now that is difficult, because that makes it very hard to correct something if people aren't even interested in whether or not a statement is correct. And we have seen this in part during the COVID infodemic during the last 2 years. Now, the point I want to make here is that actually just calling it an infodemic is an oversimplification. Because one remarkable finding during the last 2 years has been that in many countries, there has been an increase in trust in scientists. Here are data from Germany. The top line there is the number of people trusting scientists, and as you can see, it went up dramatically at the beginning of the pandemic, and it has stayed high. Similar patterns are observed elsewhere. I have similar data from the UK, and I've even seen data from the US that are falling within this pattern. So notwithstanding the post-truth world, notwithstanding the infodemic, the majority of people actually is trusting scientists. Having said that, I got to return to the other side of the equation, because there is a sort of bifurcation here. And the other side of the equation is that residual vaccine hesitancy among people who are not yet vaccinated has actually been hardening. These are data from about a year ago. This is the share of unvaccinated people. You can look at the German-speaking countries at the top. Austria, Switzerland, Germany, they're winning this competition of hesitancy. Now, of those people, about 22% who weren't vaccinated at the time in Germany, 2/3 were committed to never getting vaccinated. And another 23% probably not. So that was a hardcore resistance, and perhaps unsurprisingly, about half of them voted for the extreme right, and another 15% for other anti-establishment parties, which brings us back to this populist logic whereby accuracy is no longer important. Unless you think that's just survey data, nearly a year later, as if last June, a few months ago, the actual uptake mirrored these data almost perfectly. So the people who in October said, I'll never get vaccinated, well, they didn't get vaccinated. So we cannot ignore the infodemic because it does have an effect in vaccine hesitancy and lack of uptake. But it is reasonable, I think, to quantify it. And here's a very recent paper by Sasha Alte and colleagues that tried to do that. And what they found was that if you look at overall engagement, then most people on Facebook or online were, again, actually consuming reliable information. It was only 14% of news outlets on Facebook that contributed to unreliable information. Now, that doesn't mean the glass is empty, but it also doesn't mean the glass is full of misinformation. We are somewhere in there, in between, and I think it is important not to be carried away by saying it's only misinformation out there. Well, it isn't only misinformation, but whatever is out there is bad enough because it affects people's behavior. We have plenty of evidence from experiments. In this case, study by Lumba et al. Showed that if you expose people to misinformation about the COVID vaccine, it reduces their intention to get vaccinated by a considerable amount. And we also have field data supporting that by analyzing media coverage such as, for example, Fox News in the United States. So misinformation matters because it changes people's behavior, and it matters in particular because it sticks. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if people hear or read a falsehood such as the Pope endorses Donald Trump, then even if a minute or 2 minutes or 2 days later, they encounter a correction, and of course, that was nonsense, so the correction here is the right answer. The initial misinformation nonetheless exerts an effect on people's behavior. People's memory and cognition doesn't work like a computer where you stick something in and if you discover it's false, you just go and it's gone. Doesn't work that way. Humans may say, oh, yeah, you told me it's wrong, but they will nonetheless rely on the myth still, even though they think they're discarding it. And the reason for that is that it is very difficult for people to edit their mental model of the world and to take out a key piece of information without losing track of what is going on in the world. And to avoid that, they stick to what they know, even if they also know it's false. And that is what makes misinformation so pernicious, difficult to deal with. But not all is lost. We have a whole toolbox of misinformation, countermeasures, debunkings, pre-bunkings, warnings, nudges, the list goes on. None of those is a silver bullet to deal with the problem. However, collectively, we have a lot of that stuff out there. And some colleagues of mine and I, we summarized that whole toolbox in the debunking handbook a couple of years ago, which is available at that link. But you don't need to take a photo now because I have a QR code at the end for a whole toolbox of resources. And yes, by the way, that's available in 16 languages. So we're ahead of Facebook, I think, in that case. So to illustrate, I just want to give you one tool out of the toolbox, and this is known as pre-bunking or inoculation. What does that mean? Well, it is a cognitive technique where you first warn people that they might be misled, and having done that, you then explain how they might be misled and why that misleading rhetoric is incorrect. Now, the trick here is that that means we must know ahead of time of how people will be misinformed, but not what exactly they're going to see or hear. So we can tell people things like, hey, people who disinform you will be highly emotional. They'll be all caps and they'll be yelling and screaming and, you know, it's all going to be about crime and blood and all that. Well, you know, hang on, that's probably somebody who's trying to misinform you. Even though we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we do know what the techniques are that are being used. Now, there's been numerous demonstrations over the last few years on how inoculation works against misinformation across a whole range of material, including Islamophobic and Islamist radicalization, and anti-vaccination materials, conspiracy theories, all sorts of rhetorical disinformation techniques that are out there. And here's a recent paper that, full disclaimer, was sponsored by Google, that summarized a lot of that information, and some hands-on guides about how to use inoculation is available at that link, which again, I'll pop up a QR in a moment. So to conclude, I think there are two things going on. There are clear threats to democracy arising from the post-truth world and populism. Misinformation clearly is a problem, both at scale, but also at the level of the individual. And in part, it is a problem because it sticks in people's minds despite being corrected. But not all is lost, because if you actually quantify the infodemic and the number of people affected by misinformation, you find out that the majority of people is actually not down the rabbit hole, but is quite aligned with science and evidence-based policy. And we have quite a few tools to deal with this. And finally, yes, there's a lot of resources in various different languages I can draw your attention to. Here it is. There's no social pressure at all now to raise your camera and take a picture of that. Thank you.
Great insights, as always, from Professor Lewandowsky. Yeah, lots of hands. I didn't even ask. Go for it, please, sir. Yes, you.
Hi, so this is a question for...
Name and affiliation, please.
My name is Christian. I'm from the European University Institute. A big fan of Lewandowski's work. And I want to ask you a little bit about it, because one of the key correlating features of people who accept misinformation is also like people who are predisposed to believing the claims being made. People who already accept anti-vaccine narratives and stuff are more likely to accept those things. In the inoculation studies that I've seen, I haven't seen people checking for pre-existing biases. And I wondered if you could expand more on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, is this on? Yeah. First of all, I agree. You know, some people are predisposed to believe certain things more so than other things. We have done inoculation work in the context of climate change, where we found that it is actually the people on the political right who are more predisposed to be misled by climate denial. They benefited the most, or at least as much, from inoculation, because they in particular do not like being manipulated. And if you teach them, hey, somebody's playing with you, then they actually are quite responsive to that. Now, that's just one study I can think of. In general, I don't know of any sort of meta-analysis or anything for that, but the signs are encouraging.
Thanks so much. Another question, please. Yes, the lady over here with the glasses, please.
Thank you. My name is Natalia Kadenko. I'm a researcher at Delft University of Technology. At some point, I had a group of very interested bright students who did a project on COVID disinformation. And they were interested in seeing whether the interest in the COVID skepticism and vaccination hesitancy narratives in the Netherlands correlated with the decreased readiness to actually take vaccination. And they didn't find that. However, once they looked in the detail, when they split these narratives into several, they found that the gateway to vaccination hesitancy that's translated into lack of vaccinating themselves was not a certain narrative, but a personality. So certain leaders in the Netherlands who became at some point prominently featured on the news, they led to interest. They were the gateway to the rabbit hole. So I was wondering whether it's possible to inoculate against this interest in the proto-Trumps, if you might, in this populist or just charismatic leaders, because apparently we're not resistant against it.
Yeah, well, you made several interesting points. So let me address the first one about no relationship between expressed vaccine hesitancy and actual uptake. That's not an isolated finding. Vaccine hesitancy can be very fluid. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, the beginning of the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, the public health community in Europe was terribly concerned about France, because only 20% of the French said, I'm willing to take a vaccine. Now, a year later, France has a vaccination rate that is way ahead of Germany and way up there in the 80s or 90s. And it wasn't just a mandate. It was that as the campaign took off, and it became normative to get the vaccine, more and more people gave up their hesitancy. So there's a lot of precedent for that once a vaccination campaign starts and your neighbor has had a shot and your grandmother has had it and no one has had any side effects, then everybody gets vaccinated. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but you get the general idea. So that doesn't totally surprise me. The idea of personality and leadership, totally. I think, one of the biggest drivers of vaccine hesitancy, other than belief in conspiracy theories, is psychological reactance. Now, reactance is a personality trait, sort of, that predisposes people to reject anything that they're being told to do. I will not wear a seatbelt because it is my right to die, okay? That is sort of the do not tell me what to do, I'm a libertarian. That personality is very much anti-vax. I mean, the data on that are very clear. So if those people then have a mouthpiece or, an amplifier and they can talk to others like that, then you will have people who refuse to take vaccines. There's no question.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on in. We also, just if I may, we've got some exciting new data actually through the Kokomi project, Steve, which is actually looking at personality traits, as you know, and linking that with pre- and debunking strategies. So more to come.
Just to quickly jump in on this, with the caveat that I'm neither a researcher and that I'm also pretty upbeat on the promises of pre-bunking. I think the question about the political impact it might have, I would be very cautious, at least myself, in thinking about it, in the sense that some of the pre-bunking we discussed is about cautioning people about manipulation techniques like scapegoating or overemphasizing some news or using fear. And it's not necessarily the case that only one political side has a monopoly on these techniques, and so we might think through the notion that there might be one of the consequences might be less trust overall, in which case we also have to think what that means, right? So this is also to say, like, these are not directional in that way.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to check in with Alex. Do we have about another 5 minutes? Is that okay? Right. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. I see the person over here, please. With him. Yeah, just behind you. Name and affiliation, please.
Hello. Hello, my name is Andrei Tiot, Global Focus Romania. To Mr. Lewandowsky, you mentioned that only 40% of the information on Facebook is disinformation. I was sort of wondering to what extent can we apply similar number to subcategories. For example, let's say that my information diet is 90% very correct information about Kim Kardashian and the band Gothic, and 10% is disinformation, strong disinformation about viruses. I am nevertheless, for all practical purposes, a very misinformed man, even though most of my information is correct. And we have seen, or I have seen, cases of really cultivated people, people with knowledge on vast amount of subjects that fall prey to misinformation. So is there any research on the types of information?
Yeah, good question. First of all, the Facebook study was engagement with news sources about COVID specifically. Okay, so the 14% was out of COVID news information. It didn't count other misinformation. But you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, yeah, it doesn't take much misinformation for a person to then make decisions that have flow-on consequences that are detrimental to themselves or to society. And this is one of the real big problems in the background of trying to quantify misinformation in society, which people have recently tried to do. And there's a lot of estimates that are surprisingly low. But what that is overlooking, in my opinion, is how some of that misinformation then goes mainstream or is setting the political agenda. And so it is quite possible that the political agenda-setting power of that 14% is far in excess of its proportion on Facebook. So it's a very difficult issue to quantify. The only point I wanted to make is that you know, if you look at the actual interaction between people and misinformation, it isn't quite as catastrophic as some of us may think.
Thank you, Steve. Hella, you'd like to come in on that as well?
Yeah, just quickly. So I agree. It's really hard to quantify, but I think that's and we know there's studies on like showing how different misinformation resonates with different communities. But I think that's why it's so important to basically target the analysis and the countermeasures to the group that it's affecting the most. So you know, like kind of that's why I'm saying like we usually look at specific events, specific kind of you know topics that are actually where there's indications of like high kind of, you know, impact or influence kind of by certain communities, and then understanding who is mainly targeted. And so like, you know, like then you kind of need to tailor your, you know, your pre-bunking or your kind of information, like kind of informing people, like build resilience building education to those groups. I think that's kind of like, yeah, all we can do.
Brilliant, thanks so much. Excellent questions from you all. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. A big round of applause for an excellent panel. And I'm pleased to hand the floor back, please, to Diana, because you're going to be announcing an exciting masterclass.